Okay, we have talked about greenhouse gas emission reduction and its costs, and now we're going to talk about the other side of the benefit-cost equation, that is the impacts of climate change. Why do we think climate change is a problem that needs to be solved? I'm going to spend 3 weeks on that. The intention is that before the break I get through this agenda, where I talk about 2 things. One, the impacts of climate change from a physical, biological, physiological, and occasionally chemical nature, and talk about the human response to this as well. Don't know whether I'll succeed in an hour, and then we're going to talk about the economic impacts after the break, or we're going to make a start with that. So this is where we are in the schedule. I'm not going to stop here today, but I'm going to pick up a bit of the economic impacts as well. So let's get started and talk about the impacts of climate change on nature. Now, if you drive south through Europe or hop in a plane and fly south, and I assume that many of you have done that, what you notice is that the landscape is different. And one of the things that is different is that you will find different plants and also animals in southern Europe than you would find in northern Europe. And this is a result of a different climate. Plants rely on sunshine to grow, and they grow, different plants grow when it's warmer. Also different plants grow in wet climates rather than in dry climates. So it stands to reason that if we would have a different climate in the future, we would also see different plants growing than where they are growing today. Those are direct effects, but there's also competition between plants. It may be that the plant is still able to go but can't compete with other plants, and of course it also affects everything that feeds on those plants. So you would also expect to see different animals there. These effects can be quite drastic and quite substantial. What you're looking at here is a fairly awful graph. It's a map of the world. As you can see, the different colors, the darker the color, the greater the model agreement. So what they did for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is it runs a whole bunch of ecosystem models and then see whether these models agree with one another. And what these models agreed on is a so-called biome shift. Now, a biome is not an individual plant or an individual animal, but it's a whole ecosystem. So the rainforest is a biome, or the tundra is a biome. So it's a complex of plants and animals, although in these models it's mostly plants. A biome shift is therefore a complete change in the ecosystem. So the Brazilian rainforest turning into savanna would be a biome shift. And what you can see is that by the end of this century, around 30% of models, maybe 40% of models say that this is likely to happen because of climate change. In the northern latitudes, you see also shifts in changes from current tundra to boreal forest, right? So this is a completely different landscape. A completely different landscape, right? And if you care about these things, then you would expect large changes, or you should get worried about large changes in the natural environment. Now, the first statement that is made is sort of a truism, right? And everything is affected, and it doesn't tell you a whole lot. We can actually be a little bit more precise there. And there's all sorts of different plants and animals, but in general, those plants that do well everywhere, the so-called generalists, like cockroaches and humans, they can sort of thrive in a large range of climates, so you don't need to worry too much about them. But those plants and animals that are tied to a very specific ecological or climate niche, they are the ones that are most likely affected or heavily affected. And the example that I use here is Edelweiss, which in the wild grows up high in the Alps. It's not because it particularly likes it there, but because it's the only plant that is tough enough to grow there. And the Alps are a particularly hostile climate. You have very hot summers. Because you're so high up, you also have a very big dose of radiation. And then in winter, you get covered in 2 meters of snow for months on end. So this is pretty tough if you're a plant, right? But Edelweiss can withstand that. Now, Edelweiss can withstand all sorts of things, but one thing it cannot stand is competition. So Edelweiss grows in your garden, provided that you keep the weeds down all the time. But otherwise, it would simply die. So if climate were to change, and Edelweiss would be pushed out of the Alps because it's getting too hot, where can it go? Well, in the Southern Alps, it's relatively easy. It can move to the next mountain, right? Of course, it cannot travel through the valley because there's competition of other plants there, but its seeds could blow there. But if you're in the northern edge of the Alps, it has nowhere to go, right? Because the next mountain range is in Norway, and that is too far for the seeds to travel. So a plant like Edelweiss in the wild, because of climate change, would be in trouble, because it occupies such a very specialized ecological niche. And the same is true for the Vietnamese golden cypress, which only grows in a very narrow range at a very specific height in the mountains of Vietnam, obviously, on a very particular soil. And if climate were to change, this particular tree, this is a maquette, this is the actual tree, not this, but this is the actual tree. These plants will be in trouble because they're specialized and they're at the margin of their existence. Now, plants that are, and animals that are at the margin of their ecological niche, two things can happen. Either that margin can disappear and they'll go locally or maybe globally extinct. It could, of course, also be that climate changes in their favor. And then you see a large explosion of these plants. Now, what is true for plants out there, unmanaged in nature, is also true for plants that are managed, that is, crops. They would also be affected by climate change, by changes in temperature, by changes in rainfall, by changes in wind, by changes in radiation, by changes in cloud cover, and so on and so forth. So let's look at agriculture and get to the second theme of today. But first let's look at focus on the red results that you're looking at here. So we're looking at 6 graphs, obviously. Rice, wheat and maize. These are the 3 crops that provide 50-60% of the calories that we eat. So these are the most important crops, right? If you're worried about food supply to humans, and because of the projector, you can't see that this is in the temperate zones and this is in the tropical zones. And what you see is a whole bunch of results. In the red dots are individual model studies. And the red line is sort of a curve that is fitted through these dots. And you see a range of results. Like if we focus on wheat, which is a cold-loving plant, and we're looking at what is going on in the tropics, then you see that 5 degrees of warming would lead to a halving of the crop yield. So you get half of what you currently get in kilograms of wheat per acre than you would do today, right? So that is a fairly drastic loss. Other crops, you see much less of a reaction. If we focus on rice in the temperate regions, you actually don't see that's much of a change. And that is, of course, because rice is a heat-loving plant. Wheat likes cold, maize and rice actually like it hot. So they are much less susceptible to warming. They may, of course, be hit hard by drought, right? All plants like water. So that is the red curve and the red dots. And this is based on the so-called dumb farmer hypothesis. And the dumb farmer hypothesis is best illustrated not with farming, but with sunbathing. So you're looking at a picture of a beach. There's lots of people here lying, enjoying the sun. And this woman here lies flat on the beach. Her head is 30 centimeters above the sand. Now, if the sea level were to rise by 50 centimeters, as it may well by the end of the century, I'll come back to that at the end of the hour, she would drown. Right? I see some people smiling. She wouldn't, right? And why wouldn't she? Because she has eyes, she has ears. She notices that the sea level is rising, she would get up and walk away, right? Actually, 50 meters of sea level rise is by the end of the century. The average time that people spend on the beach is 2 to 3 hours, right? So she won't be there in the year 2100. And if her grandchildren come and visit this beach, they won't insist on doing the exact same thing that grandma did and lie in the exact same place, right? That is not how we do things. But in this red curve, that is exactly the assumption. The assumption in the red results is that farmers will continue to plant the same crops at the same time, apply the same amount of fertilizer, the same amount of irrigation, and harvest the plants at the same time as they have always done. Right? There is no response on the farm. And even if these farmers sort of like see that, oh, their crops failed in 2050, let's try the exact same thing in 2051, that's what the red results assume. This is called the dumb farmer hypothesis, which is a misnomer, right? It's not the farmer who is dumb, it's the analyst who made this assumption who is dumb, right? But it's typically known as the dumb farmer hypothesis. The reason that people do that is because most of these studies come out of natural scientists who have a great problem with human agency. They think it is difficult to model humans and therefore it is better to make an absolutely stupid assumption that's easier to get away with than the scary thing of modeling human behavior. The blue results do have an on-farm response. So changes in cultivars, changes in planting dates, harvesting dates, irrigation, pesticide, and what have you. Now you see 5 graphs that are as expected, right? So if we allow farmers to respond to the climate, what you see is that this very negative result here is not so negative, right? what you also see is that a negative response of wheat without adaptation turns into a positive response with adaptation. People take advantage of the longer growing season. A lot of wheat is grown over winter. That is because lands are fallow otherwise in winter, so you might as well plant some wheat and it'll sort of make it through the winter. But if you have a very mild winter, then it grows much faster, right? And makes bigger seeds, and that's of course what we care about. The only mistake that you see here, or only deviation from this pattern that adaptation is good, is in maize in the tropics. And the reason for that is the little numbers that you see at the very top. There is 120 studies without adaptation and 92 studies with adaptation. And the geniuses that made this graph did not think of correcting for selection bias, right? If you do correct for selection bias, the sign flips on the adaptation, and adaptation is good, right? Now, this only includes on-farm adaptation, and you see a whole mixed bags of results. So what does this mean for you, right? Well, one way of doing this is putting everything into a model of agricultural trade. And then you have an overall price index. What does the price of food do in general? And you also, once you do that, you allow for additional adaptation. Because if rice does well and wheat does not so well, or let's do it differently, if rice does well, if wheat does not so well, but maize does well, then what the consequence is that the price of bread goes up and the price of tortillas goes down, right? So you being test wrap students would eat more maize wraps and fewer and less bread, right? That would be a logical response. So you would see shifts in consumption. You would of course also see shifts in production patterns, right? And in some places you would stop growing certain things and you would do other activities on that land, and then the production would shift elsewhere. And agricultural trade models include all these things to the best of their ability. And here are the results. What you're looking at here is an index of the wholesale price aggregated across the world, right? So this is the world market price for cereals, essentially. It's price. So if the price goes down, that must mean supply goes up, right? So agricultural production expands, and then when the price goes up, that means that supply goes down. Now you see two sets of results here. There's these two studies that show that the initial effect of climate change is positive, but more pronounced climate change has negative effects, higher prices, good for farmers, bad for consumers, right? Whereas these results here show negative results right from the start. And the difference between these studies and these studies is CO2 fertilization. So far I talked about climate, but in the very first lecture we talked about the causes of climate change, right? And one of the causes of climate change is CO2, more CO2 in the air. Now CO2 is plant food, right? So what do plants do? They take water from the soil with their roots, they take CO2 from the air through their stomata, and then they use solar light to break down the CO2 into C and O2, and the water, the H2O, in H and O2. They dump the oxygen into the atmosphere, which is good for us, and they keep the C and the H, the carbon and the hydrogen, and combine it into a carbohydrate, also known as stems and leaves and flowers and roots and what have you, right? So that is what plants do. Now in order to so if there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, that means there's more plant food for the plants, so they grow faster. That is actually a fairly small effect. But there's another effect, and that is that plants get CO2 from the atmosphere through their stomata. They can be sort of pictured as mouths that they open to grab CO2 from the air. Now, if you have a cold and therefore you sleep with your mouth open, you wake up with a very dry mouth and very thirsty. The same is true for plants. They evaporate water through their stomata. But if there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, they can keep their stomata closed for longer, and therefore they transpire less water, and therefore they become more drought resistant. And that is actually the bigger positive effect that you see here. More CO2 in the atmosphere, good for plant growth. That changes the climate. That is on balance bad for plant growth, right? And what you see here is a positive effect at first, negative effects later. Now this includes a whole lot of adaptation, as I said. This includes shifts in diet. This includes changes in production patterns spatially. But it doesn't include much by way of public policy. And there is a lot of public policy in agriculture. There's two things that are particularly worrisome. One is what you're looking at here is the Common Agricultural Policy, the CAP, in the European Union, but the picture is from when the UK was still in that. The Common Agricultural Policy has two main purposes. One is to shield farmers from market volatility. And this is not limited to Europe. You'd see the same policies in Japan, in the UK, in Australia, in the US, and in Canada. Basically, all major producers have policies in place to mute the price signal for farmers. Which of course means that if you go through a series of bad harvests, what happens if you're a farmer is that the government will make up the loss. Which of course implies that you don't have so much of a reason to try and do new things, right? If you bury the full cost of a bad harvest, then you think much harder on how to avoid a bad harvest, right? I mean, you don't. And one of the things is to change your production. Now, the Common Agricultural Policy has a second aim, and this is unique to Europe, and that is to minimize the dispersion of agricultural income across Europe. And you see that here in places where it is actually quite stupid to grow things, farmers get higher subsidies. Portugal, the Portuguese Miguel isn't here. The mountains in Portugal are one example where there's a lot of subsidy. If you've ever been there, this is dry, this is stony. If you're a farmer, you don't want to be in the Portuguese mountains, right? But you do get a very high subsidy, and that is because we want to preserve traditional farming and traditional lifestyles and all that sort of stuff, right? And that is exactly not what you want in agriculture with climate change, right? Because circumstances change. That means you need to try new things rather than old things. But the subsidy system in Europe is such that we preserve the old, right? Which becomes increasingly inappropriate. And then, of course, we also have agricultural tariffs, which makes it expensive to import food from outside Europe. And that, of course, also means that you cannot just shift production from Europe to elsewhere, right? You essentially, again, lock people into current behavior. So adaptation is mostly good, but there's also a lot of stuff that you think, well, perhaps we could do this differently, right? Okay, let's talk about the impacts of climate change on water, right? And climate change affects the demand for water. Not just if it's hotter, you would drink more. If it's hotter, farmers need to irrigate more, so those are increases in demand. Also, a lot of thermal power plants are cooled with water, right? And if the temperature goes up, you need more water to cool these power plants. So that is the demand for water that will change, but also the supply of water will change, right? Through changes in rainfall patterns. This is another IPCC map that again is very peculiar. In this case because of its choice of colors. Not just for the colorblind out there, right? I realize that this doesn't work for you, for some of you. But for those who are not colorblind, it doesn't work either. So what we're looking at here is the return period of a flood. And essentially, the middle point is a flood that occurs on average once in 100 years. So the annual probability of this happening is 1%, right? This does not mean that it happens exactly every 100 years, right? But the chance of it happening this year is 1%. Now in blue, we're looking at an increase in the return period. So in the very dark blue, the floods that occur, the flood depth that occurs once in 100 years now occurs every other year in the future after climate change, right? So that is the blue. And then in the red, in the very dark red, the once in a century flood becomes a once in a millennium flood, right? Now typically we associate red with bad, right? But in this case red is good, right? And blue is bad. And what you see, for instance, where we are, is a sharp increase in the flood frequency, right? And what you see is that basically everywhere where there is rain, where there are floods at the moment, so the deserts are exempted, but in all other places you see a change in flood frequencies. In some places you actually see continental drying, right? Which may cause other problems. So you can expect water supply to change everywhere. So what do you do against that, right? Now, forecasts of climate change are very uncertain. And I showed a graph that is similar to this. Meaning if we look at the projected change in the global mean surface air temperature over this century, we're talking about perhaps half a degree of warming, perhaps 5 degrees of warming, right? That is very uncertain. How do you respond to that? And this is the global mean, and this is temperature, where at least we know the sign. But if you look at rainfall, we actually see very complex spatial pattern that is very uncertain. You see drying in some places, wettening in other places. You see drying in some seasons, wettening in other seasons. And what I did not tell you yet is that the dotted areas are, no, it's the other way around. That in the dotted areas, the models agree on the sign of the change. Recall that there's about 45 climate models that do these sort of things. In the dotted areas, models agree on the sign of the change, not on the magnitude, whereas in the areas that are not dotted, the models can't agree on the sign of the change. The basic physics will tell you that if temperature changes and pressure changes and wind changes, then rain must change as well. But we don't even know the sign of the change, right? So how would you respond to that? Well, in Most systems, I showed you the lady on the beach sunbathing, this is not an issue, right? Because she's there for a couple of hours. And when she comes back, or when her grandchildren come back, they will make up their own mind what to do. Similarly, if you're a cereal farmer, the decisions that you make is what seeds to plant and when for the next season. If you plant wheat in spring, you harvest it in August, maybe July of the same year. So what do you care about what the climate will be in 2050, right? It's completely irrelevant for the decisions that you make. And since you don't care about what the climate will be in 2050 when you make a decision about the next growing season, you also don't care about the uncertainty, right? It's irrelevant to you. It is not irrelevant if you're putting in long-lived infrastructure, right? If you're building an irrigation system, or if you're building a dam and that's supposed to last for 100 years or longer, then you need to make sure that that thing still works in 100 years' time, right? So it's only when you're making long investments in long-lived infrastructure that you really need to take care about the future. The same, by the way, is also true if you plant olives, for instance, because olive trees are also supposed to last for how many years? Some olive trees are 1,000 years old, right? So it's only when you're making investments in the very long run that you need to take this into account. Now there's two ways of going about this. Either you can make your whole system more robust, that is, pour in more concrete, make the whole thing stronger. That typically works if you know the sign of the change. Then you can say, well, it's gonna get hotter, and therefore I'm gonna need more air conditioning, I'm gonna need more cooling towers. I don't know how much hotter it will be, so I'll just build as many cooling towers as fit my budget. Right? Then you over-engineer. But if you don't know whether it's gonna be hotter or colder, then you need to prepare for two things, and just making the thing more robust to heat actually also makes it more vulnerable to cold. Now, we know that that won't happen, it won't cool down, right? But perhaps over Iceland, but in the rest of the world that won't happen. But if you're talking about rainfall in the Horn of Africa, we don't know whether it will get wetter or drier. So the people in Ethiopia don't know what to prepare for, right? And in those cases, it's actually better to become more flexible rather than design a system to be able to withstand anything and everything that it might face. Make the system so that you can change it, right? So I talked about pouring concrete, and you think, oh, concrete is pretty robust, right? So that is awkward. And those of you who understand concrete engineering would know that once your concrete thing is finished, you can't just put another layer of concrete on top. That just doesn't work. The only way to solve it is to take out the old concrete and then put in new stuff, so that is expensive. But you may also have noticed, for instance, if you travel to the Middle East, that there's houses with these steel wires on top. And you may have thought, like, why this is so ugly, right? Also, across places along the English coast, you would see sort of like these groins with metal bars stick out. And you may wonder, why did they not take this off? It's so ugly. It's actually dangerous as well, because these things are sharp, right? The reason is that if you leave the metal bars out, you can pour additional concrete on, right? And those Middle Eastern houses that you may have seen, actually you build the first floor, you let the metal bar stick out, and then when your son gets married, you can put a floor on top of your house, right? or when you have saved enough money to afford that second floor, right? So there is flexibility in concrete as well. That's the sort of things that you need to think about. If you're worried about rivers in southeast England, and you're worried about floods, what you can do, of course, some Tories want to do, is drain the river. And if you drain or dredge the river, then what happens is that water flows faster. And if water flows faster to the sea, you have less of a flood problem, right? Because the water is in the sea rather than in the river. The problem with this strategy is that if the water flows faster in winter, it will also flow faster in summer. And we have a drought problem in summer, so we want to keep the water, right? So this is not a very clever strategy. So really what you want to look at is places to store the water in winter, so that it doesn't flood the houses, but it floods pasture land. And then in summer you have that water to combat the drought that you might have, right? So you need to think about these things. Now, if you ask engineers, they love to think about these things, right? So all these problems can be solved, provided that you have a budget, and provided, of course, that you have smart engineers who also care about the future, right? But for most systems, this is not an issue, right? Because the turnover is much, much quicker than climate would change. Next one, heat stress. So climate change affects all sorts of stuff, right? I talked about a few things. It also affects energy use, obviously, both heating, less heating in winter, more cooling in summer. Obviously it affects tourism, it affects construction, it affects transport, roads get damaged, planes don't take off, bridges don't open, roads melt, right? You've been through a pretty hot summer and you may have seen some of that. It also affects labor productivity through heat stress mostly. The way that works is as follows. We are warm-blooded animals, and that means that we need to keep our core temperature at 37 degrees Celsius, right? And if we deviate too much from that, our organs will fail, right? So you work hard every day to keep your body temperature at 37 degrees. Most of that is unconscious, but you do. Now, the way we do that, if it's very cold, we shiver, put on more clothes, get close to the fire. If it gets very warm, we put on less clothes and we sweat, right? That is actually our main cooling mechanism. That is, we evaporate water. Now, this is actually hard work. And if you guys are 20, 21, maybe 22, most of you look pretty healthy, you're just tired. During heat waves, you just get tired, right? Because your body works to cool. The implication of this is that you're less able to do physical work, right? Not so much a problem for you guys because you mostly work indoors, so hopefully air conditioned, so this is not a big issue. But if you're a construction worker or a farmer, this is a big issue. And it's particularly a big issue in humid places. Because as I said, we cool our body through evaporating water. But if the air is already saturated with water, that is, it is very humid, then you can't evaporate water because the air won't absorb it. And some projections show that in places like Southeast Asia, in 50 or 60 years' time, labor productivity because of climate change could fall by 30–35%. That is a big number, right? Recall Micro 101. Your weight is proportional to your productivity. So So if your labor productivity goes down by 30%, your wage goes down by 30%, right? Same order of magnitude. That is a big impact. Now this is what happens to healthy people. If you have unhealthy people, people with pre-existing cardiovascular problems or pre-existing respiratory problems, or people who are very young or very old, then actually this heat stress might kill them, right? It might simply be that the heat is too much, puts too much strain on their heart and tops them over, right? And that is a real concern. There is a counterbalancing fact, and that is that cold is also bad for you. Not so much hypothermia. Very few people die of hypothermia. In England, it's mostly guys who are drunk and think they are very robust, right, who die of hypothermia. But other than that, unless you happen to fall into the river, the chances of, in midwinter, the chances of you dying of hypothermia is very, very slim, right? But what we also do in winter is that we stay more time indoors, and typically we are in much closer contact with other people. So in winter time, infectious diseases just run rampant. In summertime, we keep our distance from others, but in winter time, we are very close to others, and therefore infectious disease, particularly flu, also kills a lot of people. Sort of in temperate climates, sort of north of Paris, roughly, cold-related deaths are actually much more prevalent than heat-related deaths. And the projections for climate change is actually that we see a net decrease in mortality because of this. More southern places, it's actually the other way around. I'll talk about the infectious diseases the week after next, right? So what sort of adaptation do we have here? Now, what should you do during a heat wave? You should wear little clothes. You should stay calm. Don't work too hard physically. Keep out of the sun. Also, when you're English, keep out of the sun. And you should drink lots, but no alcohol, right? Alcohol actually closes your pores, actually makes it sweating harder, makes your cooling system less effective, but you should drink lots of water or juice or something like that. And these are private decisions, right? This is something that you do. I don't need to tell you that you shouldn't put on your winter coat in summer, right? That is actually something your mother taught you, hopefully, or your father or somebody else. And actually, very young babies until they're 6 months or so cannot sweat, right? So you need to be very careful with them overheating. And children until they're 5 or so don't make the connection between the clothes they wear and how much they run around and how hot they are. But you guys are beyond that, right? I don't need to tell you these things. What are you guys laughing? This is a private decision, right? Rishi Sunak has nothing to do with this. That is not to say that everything is individual. Some adaptations are actually collective, right? For those of you who've been to Spain or southern Italy, you would have noticed that they eat very late. And that is an adaptation to heat, right? Because actually it takes a lot of energy and it generates a lot of heat to digest food. So you want to do that in the cool of night. You want to eat at 10 in the evening or at midnight. Similarly, it makes sense to sleep through the heat of the day. This is not because they're lazy, this is because they're clever, right? Doesn't make any sense if you're in England to sleep during the heat of the day, but it does make a lot of sense in Southern Europe, right? Now, this is a collective decision, right? We have a lecture scheduled at 1, right? So you can't take a siesta. So this requires some coordination. Similarly, if you want to eat late, the restaurants need to be open late, right? If in the German countryside you show up at a restaurant at 8 in the evening, they spit at you, right? For disturbing them in their free time. So this is collective rather than public, right? And at best what the government can do here is run a heat awareness and preparedness campaign, right? But those things are actually not very effective, so it's unclear whether the government should step in. Which is not to say that there is no government response to heat waves, right? And let's look at the 2003 heat wave in France. For those of you you guys were so young then, right? So you don't recall. The lowest estimate is that in France in August in 2003, 43,000 people died because of heat. You also are too young to recall 9/11, right? 9,000 people died in the attack on the Twin Towers. 43,000, some say 60,000 people died in the heat wave in 2003 in France alone, and then tens of thousands more across Europe. So this was major, right? Now, why did this happen, right? Well, this was a complete failure, right? So it was France, it was August, so everybody was on holiday. So people presented to their GP with symptoms of heat stroke, and the GP was on holiday. So they went to the hospital, and the hospital was closed because everybody was on holiday. Right? There's simply the health system did not have enough resources to deal with this. Because of France, because of bureaucracy, there was only one person who would have the authority to recall doctors and nurses to help people, and that was the Minister of Health. And the Minister of Health, it was France, it was August, was on holiday, and the sucker did not bother to read the newspapers. Did not read what was going on back home. And as a result, lots of people died because of a lack of medical attention, essentially. Really, really, really bad. Now this happened once in 2003. Scared the hell out of everybody in Europe, right? And as a result, we now have, in France they actually have procedures to override these authorities, to call back nurses, to call back doctors, and all other European countries, as far as I'm aware, have developed a heat preparedness plan. So this won't happen again, right? But it did happen then. So that was France. Philly. Another big heat wave. Hundreds of people died, not 10,000s. What happened there, so hundreds of people died, it is sort of a post-mortem. What happened here, one of the things that was a problem is that a lot of people did not have air conditioning. So during the heat wave, what they tried to do is seek relief from the heat by going to the shopping mall, right? Because that is air conditioned. But the security guards had strict instructions to remove anybody who was not obviously shopping. And as a result, people sought relief, got kicked back onto the street and died, right? So that's something that you can work on, right? And there are now, we have food banks, we are setting up warm banks, right? Because, but we're also setting up cool banks now for summer, right? That people are allowed to go into shopping malls. In Chicago, another big heat wave. What happened? Hundreds of people died. Why? Two things that happened here. One, they went into some houses and they thought, well, somebody has an air conditioning, or at least a fan. Why did they not turn it on, right? why did they choose to cook to death rather than turn on their fan? And the reason was that they could not afford the electricity. Right? So one thing you want to do during very, very hot summers is subsidize electricity, right? At least for the vulnerable, or give them vouchers so that they can afford to keep themselves cool, right? If they have the equipment. Also in Chicago, what happened was that people sat in their apartments, refused to open their windows regardless of how hot it was inside. And that is because they were afraid of the crime, that if they opened the window, somebody nasty could get into their house and rob them or kill them. So that's another thing you want to do, at least in those places where the police is seen as friendly and helpful, put more police officers on the street, right? To make people feel safe enough that they can go to cooler places, that they can open their windows, right? So these are all public responses, right? You want to send more police officers on the street where the police is seen as friendly anyway, because of two other reasons. When it's very hot, particularly when it's hot at night, people are not very good at impulse control because they tire. So the result is two things. One, there's more violent crime, whereas you, in normal circumstances, think that your neighbor is annoying because he makes so much noise. During heat waves, you think your neighbor is so annoying and you go beat him over the head, right? And you want to prevent that, and that's actually in many police manuals that is actually what happens. This also extends to sexual crime. So in normal circumstances, men go around and think, that's a pretty girl, right? During heat waves, they act on that impulse, right? So you've been warned, right? Don't fall in this trap, guys. Don't be the dick that loses self-control. And again, you want to also have a public part on the response there. Almost done. Final thing. I already talked a little bit about sea level rise and people sunbathing. There's more going on. Sea level rise leads to land loss, right? Unless you say, well, I'm going to protect my land by building dikes and seawalls and those sort of things. So in other places it would lead to higher costs for coastal protection. And it's not just the things that we directly care about, our agricultural land, our cities, but there's also a lot of wetlands in front of the coast. Now, if sea level goes up, then you may think those wetlands will drown, but that would actually not be the case. What would happen is that those wetlands would migrate inland. They just shift inland. So that is not so much of an issue, unless, of course, there are dikes behind the wetland. Then the wetland has no place to migrate to, and it will drown, right? And you may think, well, these are mudflats, what do I care? But if you're a bird or a migratory bird or a fish, then this really, really matters, right? This is where the fish nurseries are. This is where birds, as well as local birds as well as migratory birds get a lot of their food, right? Another problem that is there is saltwater intrusion. So people worry about the effects of sea level rise on atoll islands. And atolls are those islands built of coral reefs. They are typically very low. Some of them, many of them are not much more than 1 meter above sea level rise, 1 meter above sea level. And if sea level were to rise by 50 centimeters or 100 centimeters, then those islands would be completely submerged. And there's entire nations that are built on these things, the Maldives, Tuvalu, and so on and so forth. And a lot of people are worried about these islands disappearing by the end of the century, right? Entire nations disappearing. That's actually optimistic, because there's another thing going on, and that is saltwater intrusion. So the sea is salty. We don't like salt water. We drink fresh water. And And sort of along the shore, there is this so-called saltwater wedge. And what happens if the sea goes up, you have more salt water, the sea goes up, the weight of the sea increases, and that means that the wedge between salt water and fresh water underground is pushed inland. Right? Essentially, you have salt water intruding into your fresh groundwater. And those shifts can be quite substantial. I was talking to a friend the other day who is in drinking water, that in Amsterdam, which is 20 kilometers from the sea and used to have fresh groundwater, they now have problems with saltwater intrusion because of 20, 30 centimeters of sea level rise, right? Many atoll islands also have a bell of fresh groundwater. But those islands aren't very big. So if that wedge shifts by 100 meters, then the fresh groundwater is gone, right? It all turns brackish. And island nations such as Tuvalu will run out of fresh water long before they disappear under the sea, right? And that means an end to agriculture and so on and so forth, right? And probably they will need to give up these islands within a few decades rather than by the end of the century. Again, adaptation is crucially important. Final point, and then we're going to break. Complicated graph. And it's also a messy graph. We're looking at sea level rise. On this axis, we're looking at the number of people flooded per year. This is a logarithmic scale, so this is 1 million, 10 million, 100 million, a billion. And let's just focus on the red lines, right? The different colors have different emission scenarios, but let's just focus on the red lines. So in the solid red line, what we have is what would happen to the number of people that get flooded each year in expectation if we just keep the dikes and the dunes and the seawalls as they are today, right? And what you see is that at the moment around 500 million are flooded, but in the future, at the moment around 50 million are flooded, and in the future that would be 500 million, right? That's an order of magnitude, and that's something to be really concerned about. In the dashed line, the assumption is that the protection levels of current coastal protection, it's not that we're going to maintain the current dikes and seawalls, but the assumption is that we're going to maintain the protection offered by those dikes and seawalls. So that would be, if sea level goes up by a meter, then we raise the dikes also by a meter, right? And we're still protected against the 1 in a 1,000-year storm. What you see is that makes a difference. And then the dotted line uses the assumption, well, actually, if you look across the world, you look at London, for instance, it's actually fairly well protected against storm surges by the London Barrier, or the Thames Barrier, right? That keeps the 1 in a 1,000-year storm out. But then if you go to a place like Lagos, which is another city that is built on the coast, there's no protection whatsoever. In some places you have a seawall that's about this high and that's it, right? And there's just houses everywhere. Now, why is this? Obviously, the UK is much, much richer than many places in Africa. And therefore, we can afford to protect our coasts, and the public demands that their coast is protected, right? Now, if you look at the empirical relationship between protection levels and income, you would find indeed a very strong relationship there. If we impose that, if we say, well, future African countries will be richer than today's countries in Africa, then we're actually in the dashed line, or in the dotted line. You still see that sea level rise actually makes a difference, right? Makes the situation worse. But what you also see is that 500 becomes 50 again, right? So our response in adaptation is an order of magnitude, and sea level rise is also an order of magnitude, right? And both are important. And that's the take-home message for this morning. We're going to break for 10 minutes, and then I'm going to start with the economic impact of climate change. So, I'm going to switch gears. This lecture is easy if you've done environmental economics, which none of you have done. So I'm not going to get to the end, that's pretty clear. But I am going to make a start with talking about the economic impacts of climate change. So far, before the break, I talked about these things sort of in their natural units, number of people dying, crop yields, those sort of things. But let's look at the impact on human welfare. So I'm making a start for next week, or the week after lecture. And I'm going to start with methods for estimating the total welfare impact. Hopefully I'll get most of this done today. So I showed you different scenarios of climate change, and I gave you a whole range of impacts of climate change, and actually there's many more. I skipped over a good few of them. And the impression you got was, well, climate change can be good or can be bad, it can be big, it can be small, it all depends on what I do, where I am, who I am, and when I am, right? If you recall the agricultural impacts, they started positive and they ended negative. So it's good for the people in the 1940s, in the 2040s, sorry, bad for the people in the 2060s. So we somehow need to aggregate all this into something that we can look at meaningfully. And in 2001, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change suggested that there's 4 reasons of concern, which somehow became 5 burning embers. And these are alternative ways of looking at the climate problem. If you are the sort of person who cares about unique and threatened systems, if you are the sort of person who cares about atoll islands, then climate change is a big concern. As I said, many of them will have to be evacuated within a few decades. If you worry about butterflies, or if you worry about small rodents, then climate change is a big concern, right? We have seen documented extinctions of some species because of past climate change. So it wasn't very pronounced, and we can expect much more climate change in the future, right? So if you're worried about those sort of things, climate is a big concern, right? Then you're in this bar. If on the other hand you worry about big system changes, such as West Antarctica sliding into sea, or Greenland melting, or a wholesale rearrangement of ocean currents, climate change is much less of a concern. These things won't happen this century, probably not next century, and in many cases we actually don't know whether climate change will make these things more or less stable. Just don't know. So if that is the sort of person you are, you worry about those things, then climate change is much less of a concern. The things that I'm going to talk about this week and the week after the reading, the 2 weeks after the reading week, are these 2 columns here. I'm going to first focus on what happens to the welfare of the average person, and I'm going to do most of the methodology there, and then I'm going to talk about the welfare, the distribution of those welfare impacts later, right? And then you're somewhere in between. And we need this because, as I said, the long list of impacts that we had before the break just won't tell you whether climate change is good or bad, big or small, right? You need to somehow aggregate all these impacts. And what we're going to do is use a particular super indicator or high-level indicator, and the one we're going to use is money. And that affronts some people that we're going to use money, but recall your principles. Money has three functions. It's a means of exchange, it's a store of value, but it's also a unit of accounting. And we're going to use money as a unit of accounting rather than that we're going to try and sell the planet to the Martians or something. That is not what we're going to do. We're going to just express things in money so that we can have a single indicator to look at all these impacts. But also what we can do is, because we also express the costs of emission reduction in monetary terms, we can directly compare the two and then say which one is better, right? Or which scenario is better. And of course, if you want to take it further, you want to sort of compare the size of the climate problem to the national accounts or to other problems. We also need a comparable indicator, and money stands to reason. Or, and that is something that we'll come back to later, if it turns out that the distribution of impacts is very skewed, and it's mostly people who contributed very little to climate change who suffer most of the consequences, then you may think of paying compensation to those people. And compensation is typically paid in money, right? So for all those reasons, we're going to look at money. And there's been 39 studies that estimated the economic impact of climate change on the average person on the planet. And those 39 papers produced 69 estimates, and you see 66 of them in this graph. There's 3 more that sort of here somewhere, but that ruins the whole picture. So I'm going to show this graph repeatedly, right? But just so that we're all on the same page. On the horizontal axis, we're looking at changes in the global mean surface air temperature up to 7 degrees. That's quite warm. And the reference point is pre-industrial, right? So we're now here somewhere, a little bit above 1 degree of warming. So that is the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, we're looking at the Higgian equivalent variation. That is the or the welfare equivalent income loss. The way to read this is that if the world were to warm by 2.5 degrees, then the average person would feel as if she had lost 1.7% of her income. It's not that she had lost 1.7% of her income, but she feels as if she had lost 1.7% of her income. Higgian equivalent variation, after John Higgs, the Nobel laureate. I don't think you quite got there in micro, right? So if I take away 2% of your income, you will feel bad, right? You will not like me. Climate change would make you feel the same way, but then your anger would be directed to someone else rather than me, right? So that is how to read the graph. Now there's 4 broad methods to do so, and that is what you see here: the enumerative method, econometric methods, elicitation methods, and computable general equilibrium. And I'll talk about them each in turn. And then the gray curve is sort of a model fit. The dotted lines are something like the 67% confidence interval. And you see a wide range of results. But the first question is, of course, where do these numbers come from, right? So let's talk about that. The oldest method developed by Ralph Darch in his better days, he drank himself to death, is the so-called enumerative method. And what you do there is you start with what I did before the break. You list all the impacts of climate change and you express them in their natural units. So the number of square kilometers of land lost due to sea level rise, the drop in wheat yields due to warming, the number of people dying prematurely, the number of species going extinct, and so on and so forth. And you have this long list of impacts of climate change in their natural units. And you estimate their price, you multiply price and quantity, and you add it all up. That is the enumerative method. It's as simple as that, and as complicated as that, right? Because some of these things are relatively easy, right? If your yields of winter barley fall, then what you do is you have less winter barley, you look up the price of winter barley, and you can just go to the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, right, to look up the price of barley, and you multiply the two, and you're done, right? That's easy. If you're talking about coastal protection, right, you want to raise the 10 kilometers of dike by a meter, then what you do is you call up an engineer or engineering company and ask them for to make you an offer. How much would it cost to do this, right? These things are relatively easy. It's a bit more complicated than I make it sound, but it's relatively straightforward. But we also have impacts that are on human life and on nature. And there you can't just look up in the newspaper or on the internet or by calling somebody up, what is the price, right? So for those, I don't know what's going on, we need methods of monetary valuation that have been developed in the economics literature for the last 80 years or so, almost 80 years now. And there's a range of methods that can be used. And they all have their advantages and their disadvantages. The first set of methods come under the heading of revealed preferences. And the oldest one, going back to Hotelling, Hotelling is a very unfortunate economist. You all know his work. He did the first and second welfare theorem, but we named them the first and second welfare theorem rather than the Hotelling theorems, right? So you probably never heard of Hotelling. But he did some pretty fundamental work in welfare economics as well as in statistics and other things. But one of his other contributions is the so-called travel cost method. Now, how does this work? If you go to the cinema, you pay £8 to get in, roughly. And that suggests that, at least in anticipation, you think that the movie that you're going to see will make you £8 happier or more, right? If not, you would be silly to go to see that movie. Right? So the entrance price that you pay to get into the cinema reflects your willingness to pay, how much you are prepared to get into and see into the cinema and see that movie. Now, if you go to Brighton Beach, you do not pay an entrance fee because it's a public beach. You can just walk on and do whatever you like to do at the beach, right? That is not true. Because what you do, I don't know where you guys live, but I assume that a few of you live within walking distance of Brighton Beach, but you still need to spend 10 minutes of your time walking through Brighton before you get to the beach, and you make this investment of 10 minutes walking, right? Other people need to take the bus there or travel further. If you were to go to Brighton Beach and you interview people where they're from and how much time and money they spent on getting to Brighton Beach, what you would find is that there's a lot of locals. It's Brighton, so there's also a good few people from further afield in England, but it would be unlikely if you find somebody from Sydney who traveled all the way from Sydney just to be in Brighton Beach, right? Australians are a bit mad, but that would be most peculiar. And if you find somebody like Yin Shi there, then he would be there. He's in Brighton for other reasons than to go to the beach, and the beach is just a co-benefit, right? That is not why you're here. Now, if you go to Bondi Beach in Sydney, you would find a lot of locals, but you would also find people who actually traveled from quite far, because this is one of the most famous beaches in the world. And if you go to the Great Barrier Reef, you would actually find people who traveled all the way from Brighton, spent 24 hours in a plane, spent thousands of pounds just to go see the Great Barrier Reef, right? So what you see in Brighton Beach is a lot of people who paid very little, few people who paid some more, nobody who paid a whole lot, right? So you see a demand curve. As the price goes up, the demand goes down, right? Similarly, at the Great Barrier Reef, you would also see a similar relationship, but because the Great Barrier Reef is much, much more special than Brighton Beach, you would actually see that people are willing to pay a lot more to get there. So even though the entrance fee is 0, there's actually an implicit entrance fee in the time and the money you spent on getting there, right? Now that is the core of the travel cost method, that you look at people's travel behavior to see how much they care about something, right? And it works fine for sites that can be used for recreation, right? Where the thing that we want to value is a piece of nature that people like to go and enjoy themselves in. The hedonic pricing method works very similarly. What you see if you look at the housing market, that if you compare a house that sits in a beautiful environment, commands a higher price than a house that sits in an ugly environment. The exact same house, right? Again, that is an indication of somebody's willingness to pay to live near the beach, near a forest, near a lake, and so on and so forth, right? Now there's two problems there. One is that builders aren't stupid and they don't build the same houses everywhere, right? They don't put houses in random places. No, they build the bigger and nicer houses in the nicer places, right? So you need to control for all sorts of other things. Size of the house and the age of the house and its maintenance and how many bathrooms are there and so on and so forth. You need to have data on that to control for that. And of course, it's not just the natural environment that matters. Houses near schools are near good schools are worth more than houses that are far away from schools or near bad schools. Access to train stations and all those things, crime rates, the skin color of your neighbors, all those things matter as well on the housing market, right? But you can sort of imagine that if you collect a lot of data on this and you're a smart econometrician, then you can find out the premium of living in a nice environment, right? A nice natural environment. There's another problem there, and that is that the labor market does the same thing. We see also premiums on the labor market for the environment. You guys are going on the job market soon. If somebody were to offer you a job in Paris, you think, yippee, you can't wait to go home and tell your loved ones that you're going to Paris, right? And you're even willing to take slightly lower income for that. That's not how you think about it. But when somebody offers you a job in Murmansk, your immediate question is sort of the most awful city in the world. If somebody offers you a job in Murmansk, then your immediate response is, but then I want to get paid double, right, or triple, right? And we see those things in the labor market as well. Of course, the problem here is that the labor market and the housing market are very closely tied, and both respond to the environment, right? So you need to be not just a good econometrician, but you need to be a pretty damn good econometrician to sort this through. But you can sort of see how this works, right? And this is also how we value risks to human life. And I talked about the health impacts of climate change. Well, if you are a window cleaner at the bottom of a flat building, you earn less than if you are a window cleaning at the top of the building, right? And that additional wage is the compensation for the risk of you falling down and getting hurt or worse, right? So the labor market also reflects risks to health and life, right? And you can use these methods to put a price on people dying prematurely. Again, we're not trying to sell people, right? We're just finding out how much are you willing to pay to reduce the risks of mortality and morbidity. So these methods, if you have good data, if you're a good econometrician, you can sort of like see how they work, right? The big problem with these methods is that you can use them only for direct consumption. And there's other things that we care about as well. I care about whales. I mean the animals. I also care about the country, but I mean the animals. But there is nothing in my behavior that will tell you I do. I've been whale watching once. They did not show, so I won't go again. So you could have followed me around for the last 20 years and I would not have gone whale watching. You can look at my bank statements all you like. You will not see me contributing to Greenpeace, which is one of the main NGOs that protects marine mammals, because I don't like their stance on climate and energy. So you won't see me contribute to Greenpeace for that reason. So nothing in my behavior tells you that I care about these animals. And there's only one way of going about that, and that is to ask me, or attend one of my lectures, because I always tell this story. And that is what the contingent valuation method does. And this is a stated preference. So essentially what you do in contingent valuation is you go out on the street and you ask people, how much are you willing to contribute to help protect these animals? And then you note down their answer, right? And some people will say £1, and some people will say £5, and some people care a lot and say £50, right? And there's all sorts of ways you can do this. You can interview people on the street, you can call them up, you can send them an online questionnaire, you can ask them open-ended questions. How much are you willing to pay? You can ask them sort of closed questions in a referendum format. Are you willing to pay £5, yes or no? You can give them sort of a menu to choose from and let them circle what they want. But there's a whole range of methods that can be used. There's long arguments about which works better and which works worse, but that is essentially what contingent valuation does. The problem with contingent valuation is that it's a very strange thing, because you don't shop like this. What you do when you go into the shop and you're after cornflakes, say, you walk into the shop and you walk to the aisle where the cornflakes are and you are confronted with 10 different choices, maybe 20 different choices, different box sizes, different colors, different tastes, different prices, and so on and so forth, right? And from those 20 boxes of cornflakes on offer, you pick one. That's how you shop for cornflakes. It's not that somebody walks up to you on the street and say, do you want to pay £2 for this box of cornflakes? No, that's not how you shop, right? So that is the second stated preference method, which is essentially contingent choice, where you give people a menu and say pick one. And then those menus differ in price, in environmental quality, and other things that may matter, right? And then from those choices you deduce how much they're willing to pay for the environmental thing that you're interested in. Now, the good thing about stated preferences is that you can apply them to anything and everything. You can ask questions about whatever you like. Questions about health, questions about coastal protection, questions about species. There's been stated preference studies about how much are you willing to protect the population of trolls in Norway, and people will give you an answer, right? They do. They're willing to pay to protect trolls. And elves in Ireland, for that matter. Shouldn't just pick on the Norwegians. So that is its main strength. Whereas the stated the revealed preference methods can only be used for things that have a direct consumption value. The drawback of stated preference methods is that they're stated preferences. You ask people what they would pay, but you don't ask them to pay. That leads to all sorts of problems. People may simply be unfamiliar with the whole question. You know how much you would pay for a box of cornflakes because you regularly shop for cornflakes. So you have a good idea about price and quality. You don't know. You've never shopped for whales, right? You don't know what is a good price for a whale. So you're not calibrated, right? It's very strange. You may also try and manipulate the survey because you're not asked to pay, right? So you may sort of like realize, well, they're asking me for my willingness to pay, but I'm actually not going to put up money. They're going to take this study, they're going to ask 1,000 people, they're going to average those 1,000 and take it to the government, right? So you may want to manipulate the result by stating a ridiculously high price so that you pump up the average, right? To compensate for your neighbors who you think do not care so much. So all sorts of things can go wrong, but you can apply it to everything and anything. Revealed preferences are actual choices that real people made in actual situations. So yeah, people are a bit silly sometimes, they do strange things, but it is something that people really, really do. And a previous head of department of mine was really worried about his health. So what does he do? He buys a Volvo, right? This was in the United States, where Volvos need to be imported, so extremely expensive, but the safest car there is on the road, right? And then he always drove 10 miles per hour below the speed limit, right? So that he was safe, and he wore a helmet in his car, right? Yes, there are so strange people who are willing to go to great lengths to do things, but most people he's sort of in the tail of the demand curve, right? On the tail of the demand curve. But most people sort of are somewhere in the middle, right? So these methods have been used, can be used, right? Now there's 10 minutes left. There's two issues that are particularly important for the application of these things to climate change. And one is what are you paying for? This is Hicks, by the way, Emily. And there's two concepts of value. One is the willingness to pay. How much are you willing to give up of your income to acquire something? And the other is willingness to accept compensation. Suppose you have something, you lose it. How much would you demand in compensation for this? And Willig, who died earlier this week, showed that our conventional welfare measure on the consumer side, the change in consumer surplus, lies somewhere in between the equivalent variation and the compensating variation. And he also showed that compensating variation is always greater than the equivalent variation. And the reason for that is the income effect or the budget constraint. If you're asking for the willingness to pay, you're going to buy a pint of milk, then you're going to lose some money, and that means you have less money left to make other choices of things that you want, right? Whereas willingness to accept compensation is you just bought your pint of milk, you walk out on the street, somebody walks into you, you drop it on the floor, milk is gone. How much should the other person compensate you? At that point, you're no longer constrained by your income, right? You no longer have a budget constraint. And therefore, compensating variation, the willingness to accept compensation, is larger than the willingness to pay, right? And the consumer surplus lies somewhere in the middle. Willig also showed that the three are actually very, very, very close, right? Because we're talking about 2 pounds, right? So it doesn't matter. Now, this was the received wisdom for a long time, until people started measuring willingness to pay and willingness to accept compensation. And measured the willingness to pay and willingness to accept compensation for the same good in the same study. And theory says, well, the ratio of the two should be 1. And what you're looking at here is a histogram of the measured ratio of the two. And yeah, there's a good few studies who are close to 1. But there's also studies where the willingness to accept compensation is twice or 3 times as high as the willingness to pay, or 3 to 4 times, or up to 10 times higher. And this does not fit old economic theory, right? Now, why would this be? Well, one reason I gave you, the budget constraint is different, right? But Willig also showed that that cannot be big. But there's 2 or 3 other reasons. And that is loss aversion or attachment to the status quo, and voluntary and involuntary risk. So let's start with this one first. So a willingness to pay scenario would be you're at home in your apartment, somebody comes knocking at your door and says, you know that parking lot down the road? We got permission from City Hall to convert this into a park, and we're going to replace the tarmac and the cars with grass and a fountain and some trees. We got permission to do so, but we don't have money. How much are you willing to pay for this, right? How much are you willing to contribute to this conversion? That's the willingness to pay scenario. Willingness to accept compensation is you're at home, somebody comes knocking at your door and they say, well, you know this park down the road, it's going to be paved over, it's going to be turned into a parking lot. We realize this means a welfare loss to you, so we're willing to compensate you so that you won't protest and hold up the whole thing. How much money should we give you, right? And sort of objectively, the two are the same, right? It's tarmac and steel versus grass and trees and a fountain. Psychologically, they're different, right? Because that park may be where you've walked your dog for the last 5 years. It may be where you kissed that girl, right? So you may have all sorts of memories there and those memories will be taken away when the thing is paved over. So objectively they're the same, but subjectively they're not. And therefore your willingness to accept compensation would be higher, because you don't want to lose these things. And people very quickly start to attach sort of ownership and memory to things, even trivial things, right? And for those of you who are going to do behavioral, which I think is next term, you're going to get a lot of examples from George on this. The other thing is voluntary and involuntary risks. Suppose you get drunk tonight, you go, you steal a car, you go driving, you get into an accident and you lose your leg. You would feel pretty bad about yourself, right? Now suppose I get drunk tonight, get into my car, get you into an accident, and you lose your leg. You would feel worse, right? Because there is a difference between bad things that happen to you because of your own stupidity and bad things that happen to you due to somebody else's stupidity. And you would feel worse, or you would feel different if it's a little old lady in a tiny car who gets you into an accident and you lose your leg, or whether it's some rich guy in a big Mercedes that does this to you, right? Objectively they're the same, right? You have one leg instead of two, but subjectively they're different. And this matters for climate and climate change because, right? What is climate change? Well, climate change is not something that we do to ourselves. No, the climate change that we experience now is something that our parents and grandparents did to us. And the climate change that our grandchildren will experience is something that is done to them, right, by us. And the climate change or the sea level rise that people in Bangladesh experience is not because of actions in Bangladesh, but it is because of the emissions from Europe and the United States and Japan. So it is a risk that is imposed on us by others, and therefore we would look at it differently than a risk that we impose on ourselves. And this matters for how you formulate climate change. Do we, through our emission reduction, buy a better climate for our children? Or do we compensate our children for imposing a worse climate on them? Right? And the answer is different, right? The answer can be very, very different. And this is important for the valuation of these impacts.